Welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast, now part of the Work Defined Podcast Network. Join us as we explore the vital role of compensation, strategy, data, and people analytics in navigating today's complex business world. With the resources of Work Defined, we're now bringing you deeper insights and actionable ideas from top experts. Now, here is your host, David Turetsky. Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I am your host, David Turetsky. And like always, we try and find people inside and outside the world of HR to bring you the latest on what's happening. And today we have Jacob Chase. Jacob, how are you?
I'm doing great, David. Happy to be here.
Well, Jacob, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I'm calling out of Denver, born and raised from here. I went to school out here and right out of school did the Wall Street thing. So spent 10 years in the financial capitals of the world, a couple in Chicago, New York, London, back to New York. And then moved back to Denver about 8 years ago at this point.
The pull was strong to bring you back.
It was. Family was growing and, that was a little bit of an extra push. But was working in real estate, built a real estate business back in Denver. And in running that business, got really interested in kind of the people side of how business works. And I think that's how we ultimately got connected here today.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about Infin.
Yeah, the Infin is a platform for real-time visibility into workforce performance where, when I was running my real estate company, I had challenges really understanding who are the major contributors, where are they sitting within the organization, and, what are they doing that I'm not seeing or not privy to that isn't always captured in ordinary kind of review processes. And that's what really kind of led me to develop kind of a methodology and a system that connects the performance of the organization with the individuals who are contributing to build it. And the Infin is the tool to help us kind of add real rigor to that assessment.
That's awesome. So, Jacob, we ask all of our guests, what's one fun thing that no one knows about Jacob Chase?
Well, some people would know it now, but my car is a total disaster. Like, I'm a super clean person, very organized. Everywhere except for my car, it is just
Really?
absurd. Yes. And
inside and out or just outside?
My kids have drawn in the dirt all around my car. The inside is just trashed. And, it's nice to not care.
Hey, listen, the kids are probably the ones that made it a little trashed, right? So,
they're a big part of it. Not on the outside, but, on the inside, they're guilty.
That's great. Well, I think a lot of us can probably, I think a lot of us have that same problem. I think we all can, associate with that because we get into our car, we eat in our car, we drink in our car, we just throw garbage in the back seat saying, I'll clean that out one day. And then 2 years later, when we're turning the car and we go, oh, wow, that's where this wrapper went.
Yeah, no, I try to clean it once a year, but it's getting towards the tail end of that and it's pretty ugly.
So spring cleaning is coming.
There we go.
So, Jacob, we're talking to you today about, as you mentioned before, about value. And we're going to be talking today about their view of what's valuable in an organization, as well as how do you bring people's perspectives that collectively need to align on performance and value? And how do we do that looking at a single person's contribution?
Hi, I'm Cole Napper, host of Directionally Correct, the #1 people analytics podcast in the world. Come check out our podcast that dives deep into topics like people analytics, workforce planning, and talent intelligence, helping leaders across the globe navigate the future of work with insight and a little bit of fun.
So, Jacob, in your view, what does pay equity look like, especially in the context of people's valuations of themselves?
To me, pay equity is less about kind of a market rate where, you have your salary bands of comparable companies and people aligning within that. And it's much more in alignment with how much they're contributing to the organization, to the success of their teams, and to ultimately kind of the financial performance of the business. And that can happen from every seat in the house. Everyone's got a part to play in that. And to me, pay equity is really the connecting of the contribution to the business results. And as long as the system is ubiquitous for everybody and they're all paid in the same way according to their contribution to business results, that to me is pay equity.
So it's really a question of fairness and the attribution of rewards based on the contribution to those rewards.
I think that's right. And if there's a single kind of universal system that assesses people in the same way and can kind of value their contribution individually, if people were paid accordingly, then I think that would default to pay equity.
Well, we've had this problem in the HR world for a long time because we've been working with standards of job evaluation systems and performance management systems that look very different and point to different things. What's broken about what's going on today, and why do you think that there's a way of being able to get there that will now uncover this value?
Well, one thing where I think we depart a little bit from some of the traditional thinking is that in most kind of employee assessment programs, there's a very centralized criteria about what is deemed to be valuable, where you have your different categories and people are rated accordingly on those categories. But in my opinion, I think that it's actually a problem to centralize the criteria in the first place, where everybody has their own perspective of what is valuable, where a CEO in the organization values the executive team delivering business performance. But, a new joiner who's fresh out of college, what they value is a boss that helps them get integrated,
Sure.
a team that is inclusive and is enjoyable to work with and helps them learn. And a centralized assessment system really kind of loses each of the individual perspectives in a way that I think can challenge some of the results of the centralized process on occasion.
Well, the centralized process it's one that everybody hates. It's
Right.
also one nobody really understands. Like, what's a goal and what does it relate to in terms of my job description? Is it aligned to my job description? Well, normally it isn't. And that's where a lot of people have problems is, to your point, that the subjectivity of the assessment usually has nothing to do with what they've been asked to do from higher.
Mm-hmm. Some things I think are right to be centralized, where, according to like cultural values or the priorities of the organization and how they want to conduct themselves. And creating alignment out of those things, I think, is really important. But oftentimes when kind of assessing an individual performance according to that centralized criteria doesn't really make sense. And I think you lose a little bit of the ability to really assess people's contribution through that centralized mechanism.
So what do we do to be able to get some of that individual nature of the value? How do we attribute that? Where do we go for that?
Well, I think you look to other kind of decentralized valuation systems. And, my background was on Wall Street and, I categorize myself as a recovering finance guy. But the model that has worked really well and the institution that's stood for hundreds of years are the stock markets, where it is a completely decentralized assessment of value. And, everyone has their own perspective of what matters and what deems a company to be investment worthy. But the collective judgment of everybody ultimately results in a price, more or less, that signifies the organization's value at any given moment.
Well, so how do you get all of that data to align, and who's the broker and who's the customer there? I mean, I follow your logic and I love it. And I think it's great to kind of take that market approach to it. In compensation, we always use market, but it's very different from what you're describing. Where do we get that from?
So this is really what the Infin does, right? Is it creates the internal market system for the attribution of credit, where everybody has their perspective of who is contributing to team outcomes. Who are they dependent on for their own job performance. Who do they enjoy working with? Who do they have problems and friction with? And where are things getting lost in the production chain? And when everybody aggregates their own perspectives by contributing it into, as a system, you can shake out the individual performance as self-assessed by the organization at any given moment.
Let's talk about that mechanism though, Jake, because it's really interesting, which is how do we figure out through the individual contribution as well as the collective understanding what that individual's contribution is? How do we figure that out? Because you're asking a lot of perspectives from a lot of different people. You're asking a lot of data from a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it could get gamed or it could get a little out of control. How do we make sure it doesn't?
Sure. Just like in any market system, there's regulations, right? Insider trading is illegal, and there are laws around proper behavior for market systems. And any sort of system would have to have the same safeguards in place. Where I think that within an organization, you can stimulate this type of participation in a decentralized way is through the self-motivation of each individual, where in a collective pool of assessment, there's going to be lots of intel on each individual participant. And their incentive for participating by sharing their observations about others is the reward of learning about themselves and learning about how they are viewed within their organization and within their teams and what they can do about it to improve their contribution. And I think it's the same goal as in with most assessment systems, is helping people understand their strengths and weaknesses and how to grow within an org. But I think through the pooling of collective intelligence, rather than through a centralized system, but through a decentralized one, you can stimulate intrinsic motivation to learn and get better as an employee because of the information that they get as well.
So is this peer-to-peer information? Is it peer through a system information? Is it spurring discussions between an employee and their manager based on feedback that they've gotten from others? How does it typically work?
Well, it has to be, right? There has to be some system to aggregate all of the information and to distribute it to the appropriate parties. It's important, in my opinion, that the information that gets input is confidential because there's a lot of political or
personal data. Yeah,
there's risk to sharing what you see sometimes, especially in our world. But that being said, it can't all live only in the system. There has to be an enablement of better human interaction from it.
Right. It seems like this is a cultural change too, right? It's not a systemic change as much as it is a cultural change because you're going away from systems that people, even though they hate, they're kind of used to it, but they hate it, right? Performance evaluation time. Everybody goes, yeah, I'm going to be sick that day. But what you're doing is you're setting up this set of expectations about either inputs or outputs that either help people or shape their current future or their future, meaning that the data they're getting back on themselves is about today. It's about my performance today, but it's also really shaping their career at this company.
Well, let's go back to kind of the stock market analogy, right?
Yeah.
Your price in the stock market is what it is on any given day, but the business choices inform what that stock price can be over in the future as well.
Right.
And so there's a real powerful incentive when organizations see that number in the stock market to help it go up. And I think that same incentive rests with each individual. And when they see kind of a value metric that either confirms what they believe and they want to improve or doesn't confirm with what they currently self-assess. And, I think both scenarios stimulate response. And so any value today is not necessarily the value tomorrow. There is some agency to shape what that looks like.
At the end of the day, how do we measure all this? Is it on a 5-point scale, or is it a little bit more open-ended than that? Is it more narrative than it is actually quantifiable?
Well, I think it is quantifiable because ultimately the value of any given contribution is limited by business performance. Like the pie is only so big. And so the job of this system isn't necessarily to give a stock price, but a proportionate share of contribution. And when you understand what your proportionate share of contribution is, you can link it to business results and actually begin to tie financial implications to that individual assessment.
So do you really see this replacing performance evaluations completely, or is it just another data point that can be used in context of that?
I think it can absolutely replace performance evaluations because you have real-time assessment on every given person at any given moment. And the reports that are produced via individual performance reviews can easily be generated with today's technology.
And if we talk about things like performance improvement plans and firing because of poor performance, is that also enabled through your system?
Well, I think that is an instance where it can provide data, where it can indicate where there are both opportunities for intervention as well as opportunities for recognition, where, a lot of times people aren't given due credit, where they may be in kind of underrepresented or underrecognized areas of an org that do have a big impact when you kind of map some of these internal dependencies, but at the same time can highlight where people may be taking more in compensation than they are giving to the organization in value.
Really?
And when you have that type of data, I think it can inform the decisions that leaders make regarding their workforce.
This is really fascinating to me because I'm an econometrician. I love to see, drawing lines and drawing relationships and correlations between value and rewards. And I think in the HR world, we've kind of given up being more econometric based. We used to. We did a lot of point factor job evaluation in the past, which was very econometric, and market pricing less so. I mean, yeah, we look at statistics on how jobs are paid, but it's really kind of very, very subjective as to how you place people. Objectivity is completely out the window. This seems like an objective way of being able to attribute value to pay in a very strategic way.
And that ultimately is the goal. And I think that was really kind of the question that I was trying to answer personally when running my last business. And, I think the spirit of it is one of meritocracy, where you want to really recognize and reward in proportion the contribution that's made to the collective success. And when you can actually break it down into, the dollars and cents, I think it becomes a little bit more clear the application of how you enable a truly meritocratic culture. And that, that is kind of one of the objectives, I think, of this line of thinking.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, meritocracy is critical to making sure that we're paying for contribution. And it's gotten off the rails significantly because what we've been talking about is 3% changes here and there, which don't really drive anybody toward, better behavior. But what you're talking about is really understanding the percentage portion of value created by what you do and how you perform. I'm sure it does, right? I mean, that seems like that's exactly what it does.
Yeah, I mean that's the goal, I think, of this line of thinking. And there's some shortfalls with, I think, a lot of the prevailing thinking around meritocracy, where it's still very centralized, and I think it still enables a lot of bias and is used as a justification for decisions rather than a true reward of contribution. And
I think you've just summarized exactly the reason why performance management stinks.
I think we're all frustrated with it. And,
Yeah.
But in order to, I think, really change the results of performance management, it's not an incremental improvement to the existing system. It has to be wholesale change at this point.
So how do you practically get this to happen? What steps if someone's listening to this program and goes, it sounds great. Well, where do I start? What do people do to have to change the culture? Or are there things they could read about in order to be able to get them, fast track to be able to actually take on this kind of effort?
Well, I think the big change that leaders need to really consider is allowing for a decentralized assessment of value. because there is real privilege in being able to make the decision about what is valuable in the organization that you run. But that kind of requires a centrality that instantly inhibits the ability to effectuate this kind of change. And, like it's a very dramatic example, but you look at the difference in outcomes between capitalism and communism. And there's a centrality in one, there's a decentrality in the other, and the results speak for themselves. But that's the big question I think that leadership needs to ask themselves of, if they're considering something like this, is foregoing their kind of privileged position of power in the short term in order to enable better performance in the long term.
I think there's a middle too that has to be considered, which is socialism, right? Which is there's a little bit of capitalism, there's a lot of collective thinking, and it protects people. And we live in a world we in the U.S. live in a world of basically socialistic capitalism, where there's a little bit of protection for the little guy. So how does that work? Where you really have to take into consideration that there are some protections.
100%. There will have to be, because business is inherently volatile. And if a true kind of evolutionary meritocratic system was in place, employment would also be volatile, which isn't necessarily what anybody wants. Like the business ultimately has to absorb some of the downside to enable kind of the continuity of the organization. And so absolutely, this is not like an extreme libertarianism view of, I think, how the decentralization should work.
Right.
But, the business does still have responsibility to absorb some of the cyclical downsides in order to maintain continuity.
So if you were talking to an HR director or a CHRO, and your goal is to try and introduce this even as a pilot program for a group of employees, where would you have them start?
I would have them start at the top. I would have them start with the executive team and maybe the first layer of direct reports to that, where there, clearly would be some element of cultural interest in a decentralized assessment system. And kind of seeing that example from the top helps it to gain credibility, helps the, some aspect of the vulnerability that's involved to set an example for the rest of the organization.
Right.
And that's where I would suggest folks start.
That's a great idea, especially given the fact that they probably haven't done a performance evaluation in decades. So you're basically starting from a clean slate up there.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that something that often gets lost as people rise in the ranks is their own interest in self-improvement. And I think folks who are interested in really hearing what people think, oftentimes they go to the outside and get coaches and other folks to help facilitate some of those conversations. But when people feel comfortable inputting their confidential views, you can do this yourself, and you can self-assess as a group kind of where things stand and who is really delivering results for the team and who's not in a decentralized way.
And by the way, that at the top, as you mentioned, at the top, they have a series of bosses too, and that's the board of directors usually.
Yeah.
And they're probably going to want to have a say into this as well, because they see things that from an external perspective that those internals may not, and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think an organization can decide how they want to share that information. But in the long run, the bet I'm making with this line of thinking is that, business performance will speak for itself, and that organizations who have a more meritocratic system than otherwise are going to outperform. And that's one of the difficulties is in this type of change, is it takes a little bit of an element of, of early adopter of faith, if you will, and belief and desire. That's the type of organization you want to run. But the results over time, I think, will speak for itself.
Yeah, but Jacob, I think that what you're laying out does speak for itself, because it does speak to the lack of accountability in the current model, and it provides for the accountability as well as the buy-in in this model, because you're giving people tools to enable them to understand how they fit in and how they're valued. And at the end of the day, people just care. They want to know how they're valued, and they want to know, what criteria do you use? And if you're doing it in a transparent way, that makes all the difference.
I think that, people are happy for outsized outcomes when the system that produced those outcomes is fair. That if
Right.
people had their opportunity or their fair shake at results that were similar, people tend to applaud the entrepreneurs who build something new that the world needs, rather than, if they do it in the right way. People tend to not applaud people who get rich via some political means or favoritism or things that they're excluded from. And so when you decentralize this assessment, it creates a playing field that is everyone is equal within it from the perspective of how value shakes out. And I think that motivates people because they see that their contribution is going to get recognized. And if they increase their contribution, that's going to come with an increase of rewards as well. And it's the fairness of the system that I think a lot of people get frustrated with the traditional performance review process, because it just doesn't give the same results to everybody equal footing.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So I think we're going to leave it there. And thank you very much, Jacob. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'd love to have you back on maybe in a few months to see if you've got some good case studies we can talk about and kind of amplify the message.
Absolutely, Dave. This was a blast. Thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Take care and stay safe. Thank you for listening to the HR Data Labs podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share it with your network. You can also check out the recordings on Spotify or the HR channel, now on Roku and Fire TV. Thank you, take care, and stay safe.